We're going to talk about it, so you can guess. It might come to you. Good, it's up front. Thank you. Good job or not? Good job. It's not that scary. How you doing? Good. Hello, Jeff. How you doing? The captain guys need to come up. You get brownie points later on. You get brownie points. Pat says you're the secret agent. Going in? Yeah. You gotta take both of them out. Yeah. Yeah, it should be less traumatic today, so. All right,
Welcome all. I'm going to start with the collect for watchfulness. Thou who with thine own mouth hast told us that at midnight the bridegroom shall come, grant that the cry, "The bridegroom cometh," may sound evermore in our ears, so that we may be never unprepared to meet him or forgetful of the souls for whom he died, for whom we watch and pray. Save us, O Lord. Amen. All right, so I want to talk today about attention and distraction, and then how that shapes the ways that we engage the media. But I thought I would start off by thinking about those two words, attention and distraction. You guys know what, they have the same root, this idea of traction or tension sort of being stretched. But distraction is like being pulled apart, right? Something's dragged apart, pulled apart. And to attend is to stretch toward. We get words as well like tend, right? Like if you're going to tend your garden or tend a child, you're stretching towards someone with the posture of care. And I think there's that pair of antonyms has a true implication, which is that people who are distracted tend to have the effect of tearing people or communities apart. And those who are attentive have the capacity to tend or to care or to maybe even mend communities. So we'll see how that might play out with regard to the news. I want to begin with this paragraph that I have at the top of this handout from Life Without Principle, which is a lecture that Henry David Thoreau gives. Do you get one, Alex? A lecture that Henry David Thoreau gives after his blockbuster, not really, Walden. He thought, I'm going to go on the lecture circuit and lecture. And he did a few times, but he proposes, and he's talking about, what does it mean to actually live your lives according to moral principles, as the title indicates. And one of the things that he develops in this is a critique of the telegraph and a critique of all the distractions that face people in 1850s America, which is in the run-up to the Civil War. And he proposes in this essay a really striking metaphor to describe the effects of paying attention to the steady stream of trivia that he thinks people in his era are subjected to. Like last year, I think, the Oxford word of the year was brain rot. I think it's true, which is another term that Thoreau coined back in the 1850s to describe the effects on people's brains of too many telegraphs, too many tweets. But he's going to use, as John already asked, he's going to use a strange word in here that you might not know, macadamize. And just so we're clear on the way the metaphor works, this is named after this Scottish road engineer, John Macadam, who had this brilliant idea of, and it's illustrated in this picture on the right, this brilliant idea of instead of building roads with cobbles, like large boulders, large stones, thinking that that's going to be a more lasting roadbed, his plan is to build roads out of layers of gravel, and it turns out that maybe counterintuitively that does better withstand the freeze-thaw cycle. So it lives on in words like tarmac, right? Tarmac is a macadam road that's sprayed with tar to glue it together. And the foremen on these crews would actually have calipers in their hand that they would carry around to make sure that none of the rocks that made it into the roadbed are larger than, 3/4 of an inch or an inch. So the idea is it's only going to be small stones, okay? So here's the paragraph. I believe that the mind can be permanently profaned by the habit of attending to trivial things, so that all our thoughts shall be tinged with triviality. Our very intellect shall be macadamized, as it were, its foundation broken into fragments for the wheels of travel to roll over. And if you would know what will make the most durable pavement, surpassing rolled stones, spruce blocks, and asphaltum, you have only to look into some of our minds, which have been subjected to this treatment so long. Okay? So what do you notice about these two sentences? Any metaphors, accounts stand out to you? Yeah. Fragmented attention, fragmented roads. Yeah. Ruby.
I was thinking of all our thoughts shall be tinged with triviality, and the thought of like being tinged, it's pervasive, it's
Yeah.
every part, it dyes every part.
That's a good point. It's sort of like, yeah, like a dye or some kind of pollution that the whole thing is tainted. You know, trivial is interesting too. Obviously, the metaphor here is built upon this road idea, macadamized road. But trivial also is a road metaphor. Trivia, it's like we talk about the trivium in education, right? The three ways. Trivial just means something that is found at a crossroads where three roads, trivium, come together. So if something's found where three roads come together, it must be commonplace. Everyone must know it. It's trivial. So yeah, it's etymologically the same word as trivium, but obviously we think the trivium are not trivial. So it's taken this in a different way. But I think it's interesting that he's building on this road metaphor here, and also the trivia he talks too about habits, right? The habit of attending to trivial things. I think that's helpful to think about. So, a lot of research has been done recently on neuroplasticity and how, you know, if you play the violin, your brain shapes. If you're a cab driver, the shape of your brain changes, or if you are on TikTok, the shape of your brain changes, right? That it actually does change the structures, the links in your brain. So there's a kind of effect. Of course, the good news is then that if you change your habits, you can change the way you think too. But good. Any other observations about this passage? What do you make about this profane? Our minds can be permanently profaned. Anybody know what profane means? Later on in the next paragraph, he says one of his remedies is to make once more a fane of the mind. Fane just means temple. So profane, you know, are the things that happen outside the temple, things that are secular, I guess. But he's saying there's a kind of, you know, there's a desecration that happens when we give our attention, something that should be dedicated to things that matter, that last, when we give that to things that are not worthy of our attention. There's a kind of desecration that's occurring. So I think it goes back to Ruby's point about this, the whole metaphor is built upon the kind of pollution or these structures of disgust, right? That we should be disgusted by these things because they will pollute us, and yet too often, obviously, we're attracted to things that aren't healthy for us. One more observation I'll make is that, you know, he says our minds can be profaned by the habit of attending to trivial things, and you might think, well, sometimes stuff that's in the news is serious, which is true. But I think one of the challenges of today's media ecosystem is that the social media feeds in which a lot of our news is filtered, even if you're not on social media, right? Social media still structures the way the news is produced now. That context is inherently trivializing, right? Postman talks about this in the context of the television, and I think Postman's observations about how the television trivializes even things that are serious is even more true about social media, right? When you encounter serious atrocities or serious political events, in the same context that you see cat videos or you see a meme or a joke, right? The whole context is trivialized, and you can't even attend well to things that are important. This summer, every summer I take a few weeks off the internet, and I was offline, and I was in church, and the missionary pastor mentioned the U.S. bombing in Iraq, which I hadn't heard about. And so when I got back online, I don't know, 10 days after that, I thought I'm going to read up about this, like what happened. 10 days later, I could find almost nothing about the bombing in Iraq, right? That happened, and it was a big deal when it happened, and then things moved on, and it was gone. And that just struck me as like an example of what happens when all events, even serious events, are sort of milked for what they can do in terms of the 24/7 or the second-by-second cycle. Okay, I want to reflect a little bit on some of the ways that the information flow has this effect on us, can trivialize our thoughts, and then I want to turn, look at this Marc Chagall painting and the psalm on the back and think about how we might recover attention even in this context, okay? And my sort of thesis here at this point is simply that more of a good thing is not necessarily better. Okay, so I think information is good, but then there's a certain point where more information actually can have the opposite effect. And that's what I want to think about a little bit. I think it's interesting that Thoreau uses this road metaphor, given that one of the very first acts of the U.S. government, even before the nation is formed, is to create the Postal Service, right? Ben Franklin's the first Postmaster General, woohoo, and pass these laws about roads so that the colonies knew that any success of sort of building a common culture was going to depend upon subsidized mail and improved transportation networks, right? This is going to be crucial to forming a kind of imagined community in Benedict Anderson's terms. Although at the time of the revolution, I think there's about 45 newspapers total in the US, and they're all kind of printing the same thing. It's all very manual still. And then a lot of stuff happens between 1770 and 1820 in terms of the industrialization of printing technologies. I won't go into that. But the result is that like 50 years later, America is just awash in newspapers, and you get stuff like yellow journalism, sort of sensational news, in ways that would have shocked the previous generation. I brought in a couple of facts here. I think this is amazing. In 1810, so this is kind of in the middle of this transition point, Americans bought 24 million copies of newspapers, which is by far the largest at the time. By 1820, there were 5.1 newspapers purchased per person. There were 30 times as many newspapers in America per person in 1835 as there were in England. So that gives you some context, right? Like Americans were uniquely addicted to the news, and to all, every party, every denomination, every group had its own paper, and it was kind of chaotic. Nobody, it was very hard to know what to trust. Everyone has an angle. It's nothing like broadcast media of the 1950s, right? It's very partisan. And it was into this sort of news-hungry but also difficult to trust environment that the telegraph is introduced in the 1840s. And I just want to read you a couple of quotes from an essay that was published by Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, lauding what the telegraph is going to do. So the idea is now we have some new technology that will improve communication, that will fix the problems of this rampant and sometimes hard to discern what's important, these newspapers. He says the magnetic telegraph, which is literally material thought, it's not literally material thought, but anyway, and flies as swift, absolutely annihilating space and running in advance of time, will be so extended to all the great cities in the Union so that a network of nerves of iron wire strung with lightning will ramify from the brain, New York, to the distant limbs and members, to the Atlantic seaboard towns, to Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville, Nashville, St. Louis, and New Orleans. And the effect of this, he says, that the infallible telegraph will contradict newspapers' falsehoods as fast as they can publish them, so that fraud and deception will be next to impossible. Hence, the deeper thoughts and capacities of the world will be expressed, and so lift the public mind to new heights. Okay, this is the promise. So first of all, no more fake news because we can fact check. And second of all, we'll just somehow magically lift the public mind to new heights, he says. This happened, so this was quite common sentiment at the time. Then in 1858, when the first telegraph is laid under the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, it only lasts for a few months. The technology didn't really work until the 1860s when they redid it with better cables. But the first message that's sent across the ocean is this: Europe and America are united by telegraph. Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace, goodwill towards men. You might recognize that. The idea seems to be that because we can now communicate with one another, there will be peace. Will be mutual understanding, no more diplomatic confusions, no more false facts. We just know the truth because we can communicate better. It's quite remarkable. A popular slogan of the day said that the electric telegraph will make muskets into candlesticks. Remember, this is like a few years before the Civil War breaks out. So, one enthusiastic report about the transatlantic one says, "It is impossible that old prejudices and hostilities should longer exist while such an instrument has been created for the exchange of thought between all the nations of the earth." So I like this because, we laugh at it now, right? But I think it puts into perspective some of the hype about digital technologies in our day, right? I mean, I'm old enough, I think my students are no longer old enough to remember this, but I'm old enough to remember when the Arab Spring was happening and people thought that Twitter and Facebook were going to bring about democracy to the Middle East. And then like 6 or 8 years later, Facebook is going to destroy democracy, right? And I think probably neither of those are entirely accurate. But we have this tendency to think that if we just improve the means of communication, then the fundamental problems will be fixed. And I think the reality, of course, is much more complicated. And in part, it's that just amplifying the quantity doesn't actually address the underlying problems. It tends to instead amplify the distractions. One of the interesting things that happens, I'll just mention this briefly because I think it's interesting for Christians. One of these things that happens in this context in the 19th century is that the word consensus is coined. This idea that a people, maybe a nation or a group, can have a common feeling, right? A consensus. So it starts getting applied, right? Again, consensus just means feeling with, right? Greeley's metaphor of the telegraph as the sort of nervous system of the body politic, I think, ties into this. But the idea is that we all just sort of feel the same things, think the same thoughts. We all, on the trivial side, we all know, I don't know, we all watch the Super Bowl together. We know who's going to win the World Series. We find out at the same time. And so our feelings are sort of synchronized. But one of the unforeseen perhaps side effects of this is that then when there is an exception, when somebody disagrees, we feel that disagreement more viscerally and intimately as well, right? And again, in the 19th century, the big example of this is the disagreements between the North and the South over slavery and after the Civil War. In the 1830s, a bunch of Northerners, abolitionists, sent this first mass mailing campaign, the first mass mailing campaign across the South, thinking we'll just get our information about how bad slavery is to the South. And as you might expect, the Southerners were very upset with this. They burned postmasters in effigy, and there was all kinds of riots. It did not lead to oh yeah, this is bad. We should change our economic system. I think we see the same thing today, right? It's like people think if I just get the word out about this issue, then that will bring about consensus. And instead, what it often does is it amplifies our visceral disgust with people who disagree with us. How dare you think this way? I cannot imagine that you could think X about this. And I think as Christians, right, the body that we should belong to first is the body of Christ, which has a very different network. It's not telegraphs or fiber optics. So I think what is the body that we're plugged into and what is the one that animates our feelings, I think is an important question, which we'll look at here in a minute. But to return to Thoreau, I want to just sort of briefly discuss some of his the ways that he thinks about why this is a problem and why it nonetheless persists. Later in Life Without Principle, he shifts from this macadamized mind metaphor to a food metaphor, a dietetic metaphor. Thinks about intake. In fact, Brett McCracken had a good book on the media a couple of years ago where he thinks about the food pyramid and translates that to media. It's a helpful metaphor, I think. Right, to say that, just like the food pyramid, you can have different kinds of food, but what's the proportions, right? Are you feasting on TikTok? That's probably going to be unhealthy. But this is what Thoreau says about the problems if we feed consistently, habitually, on the informational equivalent of junk food. He says, those things which now most engage the attention of men as politics and the daily routine are vital functions of human society, but they should be unconsciously performed. Not only individuals, but states have thus a confirmed dyspepsia, right? A confirmed indigestion. We're sick to the stomach, right? that thus our life is not altogether a forgetting, but also, alas, to a great extent, a remembering of that which we should never have been conscious of. So his point is that an unhealthy mental diet results in a kind of intellectual or cultural bloating and discomfort, and that it's not just an individual problem, but it's a communal problem, right? Not only individuals, but states themselves can get this sort of indigestion. And I think politics in the age of social media bears out his warnings. And he says here, the root, we can talk about the supply side of the problem, but the root problem is really the demand side, our curiosity. And there's a long Christian tradition of reflection on curiosity as a vice. There's curiosity, which is the vice, and studiosity, which is the virtue. And so Thoreau is fingering curiosity as the root sin. However, just as I think today junk food is more of a problem because it's more available, people spend a lot of money and thought to figure out how to make it maximally addictive and cheap and subsidized, right? So it becomes worse, even though the appetites have always been there. Same thing with the news, right? When you have analytics about like what's going to go viral, what's going to make people the angriest, and share this with their friends, then it's easier to design information that is bad for us, but that goes viral. And I think it's interesting, again, sticking with this food metaphor, I think it's interesting that when we succumb to this, right, when we spend too much time hate reading news or hate watching or scrolling, doom scrolling, is that what they call it, doom scrolling? The result is bad, right? Sometimes people talk about binging on Netflix, which is, again, this sort of dietetic metaphor. Like, you want to do this, and then afterwards I feel sick to my stomach. So that's the same sort of dynamic. And Walden Thoreau upbraids his neighbors who, with saucer eyes and unwearied gizzard, I love that, gorge themselves on the latest installments from the courtroom dramas. I guess they had true crime podcasts back then, too. And sometimes when I talk to students about this, they want to push back and say, isn't there some room for relaxation or downtime or just like unwinding, vegging out? And I think that's a fair point. But Thoreau's warning is that some forms of relaxation actually make the problem worse. Right? Some forms of vegging out only make us more bloated. It's like junk food, right? I think I want this, and then I eat it and I actually feel worse, right? And it's this bad, vicious cycle. I think, too, about it in terms of like these cookbooks, with beautiful pictures of good food. Like, the idea is to make good food attractive and desirable and recognize, like, retrain our appetite so that we desire what's good rather than keep indulging in those things that don't satisfy, the kinds of information that only make us angry. I'm just going to mention two, there's more I can say here, but I'll just mention two sort of effects that Thoreau looks at in terms of what's the cause of this sort of indigestion. The first is that we become incredibly vulnerable to the wiles of advertisers or politicians or ideologues or culture warriors. And I think his metaphor of the road, the macadamized mind, is helpful here. It's a good thing in a road technology if it improves the ease and speed of transport. But it's not necessarily a good thing if your mind can put up no resistance to the ideas or information that other people are spinning down your mind, right? So those with macadamized minds just have no capacity to, like, question or think deeply about what they're receiving, right? They become sort of a conduit for the memes or the slogans or the hashtags. We lack the ability to think critically, much less Christianly, about what is being sent down our minds. The second one is that our emotional or affective responses become distorted. We come to care deeply about issues or events that we have little opportunity to respond to that maybe don't matter as much, and we care less about things that we should care more about. Thoreau writes this about philanthropy, right, which is just love of mankind. And he warns that sometimes love of mankind can actually be a cover for the difficulty of loving your particular neighbor, who's much more annoying than mankind. He says, there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. And it may be that he who bestows the large amount of time and money on the needy is doing the most by his mode of life to produce that misery, which he strives in vain to relieve. One of my favorite examples of this also comes from the 19th century. It's Mrs. Jellyby, who's a character in Bleak House. She's amazing. Dickens calls her a telescopic philanthropist, which I love. And she is so concerned about the orphans in Africa, which is good, commendable. But she spends all of her time organizing meetings to talk about the orphans in Africa, and her own children become de facto orphans that some other character has to raise because she has neglected them entirely. And it's just Dickens' way of saying, like, wow, we have access to information about what's going on around the world, and we should respond to that in some ways, perhaps. But it's very easy in that context to care more about what's distant because it's in the newspaper, it's on my screen, it seems more real than what's going on closer to hand, even though what's closer to hand I actually have more ways of meaningfully responding to. I think sometimes we should put, like on our screens where we read the news, should be those little warnings like is on our car, side view mirror, objects in mirror are, in this case, I think, more distant than they appear, right? Like the things that I seem to be in my living room, in my lap, actually are maybe not those things that I should care the most about. So again, it's not that we should care nothing about what's happening far away. It's trying to recover a kind of proportionality, particularly a proportionality dependent upon what kinds of responses we can make. Okay, so I want to pivot a little bit and look at what we might do. How might we respond to these temptations and be a little bit more responsible? And the first thing I would just say is, again, to turn to Thoreau. I think he's helpful in this regard because the common misperception of Thoreau is that he goes out to this cabin in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness and totally cuts himself off from society. When the reality is he goes like 1.5 miles out of town, he walks to town every day, he's still very involved in society. He helps runaway slaves out there. He gets thrown in jail because he refuses to pay a tax that would support the Mexican-American War, which he thought was a war of empire. When he writes this very famous speech about John Brown that in some ways galvanizes attention around John Brown, kind of turns him into a political martyr and sets up Lincoln's election shortly thereafter. Thoreau is very influential on people like Gandhi or MLK, thinking about civil resistance. So Thoreau is actually very involved in the events of the day, but his involvement is predicated upon an initial withdrawal. And I think, for all of his lack of orthodox theology, Thoreau is a helpful model in that regard and reminds us that sometimes the quality of our engagement with the events of the day is inversely proportional to the quantity of our informational intake, right? So sometimes if we consume less information, we might be able to engage it more deeply and actually do something about it. So that's kind of the overall, I guess, question. In Life Without Principle, Thoreau, one of the solutions he recommends to those of us who find our attention fragmented and our emotional lives disordered is that we be tied to the mast like Ulysses. If you remember this episode in the Odyssey, Odysseus has been told he can sail by the island of the Sirens, whose songs, by the way, what did they promise him? The Sirens promised him news about his war buddies and where they're at. They promised him information that would not be good for him to know, right? So the temptation of the Sirens is unhelpful information. But anyway, Odysseus is told that all of his men need to put beeswax in their ears so they can't hear this promise, and that he needs to be tied to the mast. I think it's a helpful reminder, right? That if you want to cultivate better attentional habits, you should not trust on willpower, right? If you guys are familiar with the frog and toad stories, those great classics, there's this great one about the cookies, right? And I think it's Frog. Is it Frog who doesn't want to eat the cookies? Toad, okay. Toad's want to eat the cookies. And Frog, eventually, they try tying up the box to put him on the higher shelf. Eventually, they have the brilliant, I think it's Frog has the brilliant idea, right? Or just put him out for the birds. Like, that's the only way you're going to solve that problem, right? So it's not about willpower. It's about taking upstream decisions so that you're freed of the temptation. Nobody who wants to be healthy always walks around with a plate of chocolate chip cookies in their hand, and yet somehow we think that we can be attentionally healthy if we always walk around with a portal to infinite information in our hands. And I just think that's an unreasonable expectation, unless you are much more virtuous than I am. Thoreau, again, at the end of this section here, he says this about the remedy. If we have thus desecrated ourselves, returning to that profaned idea, as who has not, the remedy will be by wariness and devotion to reconsecrate ourselves and make once more a fane or temple of the mind. Read not the times, read the eternities. And Thoreau is drawing on this vein of biblical wisdom here, right? Proverbs 4 says, above all else, guard your heart. Paul, of course, tells the Philippians, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable. If there's any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about those things, right? So again, if that's the center of our gravity, then our engagement with the news might be more redemptive. And I like Thoreau's kind of no and a yes, right? Like we're saying no to certain things, we're saying certain limits on what we do consume in order to say yes to other things that maybe will form our souls in ways that are befitting our eternal nature. To think about this sort of yes, what are we saying yes to? I want to look at this Marc Chagall painting here, Solitude. So hopefully you have this. David printed it off in color, which is great. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Marc Chagall. He's a Jewish artist living in Paris at the time. This is a 1933 painting. Chagall was actually one of the first artists condemned as degenerate by the Nazis. So he grew up in what's now Ukraine, I believe. I think at the time it was Russia or Poland. It's very, one of these areas that keeps switching nationalities. Vitebsk or something like this. I can't really pronounce it. But that's the city in the background here. He's also, just contextually, I think it's interesting, he's working obsessively on a set of paintings to go on a copy of the Old Testament, the Jewish Torah. So he's thinking a lot about the Bible, and he paints this painting as the Nazis are kind of taking over Europe. Another side note, Chagall gets out of France on one of the very last ships across to the U.S. and spends the rest of his life in the U.S. after he barely escapes. But what do you notice about this painting? What is happening, and why is the cow playing the violin? Yes.
That the man is the light of the darkness, that he's wearing kind of a white cloak.
Yes.
Just totally surrounded by darkness. And there's reference to leading with a cow. And it kind of strikes me as shadow. Is that what we're supposed to see there?
Yeah. Bad things are happening in the looming darkness. He's wearing a prayer shawl, if that helps. So he's praying, but yes, it's ominous, shall we say. What's he holding? Yeah, he's holding the Torah scrolls, so he's holding the scriptures.
There's an earth, heaven, or earthly, spiritual.
Yes. And of course, in the spiritual heaven side, we have an angel. There's a kind of, it's dark, as John points out, but there's also evidence that God's providential will is still being worked out. Even if how that's going to happen is hard for us to see. Why is there a cow? And why is it playing a violin? Oh, maybe. Or at least, yeah, I like that idea. Okay. I'll think about that more, maybe. At least the sense that, like, this is, we should not turn to idols to deliver us from these dark events.
He's pointed away from it, so it's the distraction that he is avoiding consciously.
Okay, I think what I would say about that is that their postures are mirrored, right? Like the cow violin is mirrored the man of the thing. Is that? Um, do you guys know? So this works in both Latin and English and Hebrew. But ruminate, ruminate, a ruminant animal. Yeah. So the cow, right, is an animal that ruminates. And I think that you can also think in the Old Testament, many places. In a second, we'll look at Psalm 1, which has this image, this word. Blessed is the man who meditates day and night on God's law, who ruminates. So for Chagall, this ruminant animal is like the image of this Christian, or in his case, a Jew, who repeatedly feeds on the word. It's not like I consume it and digest it and I'm done with it, but I consume it and spit it up and chew on it some more, and I walk around and the violin, I think, is an image of this artistic, creative, participatory, active rumination, right? Like, I'm not just going to play with the word. I'm going to make something beautiful out of the reading as an act of making beauty, even in the midst of these horrors. Such a strange painting. But I think I love it because, again, Chagall is writing in dark times. He has every reason to be distraught about the politics and the dangers that he and his friends and family are in. And yet he paints this image of what does it look like to delight in the law of God and to find it worth playing with, find it beautiful, find it sustaining. Right? So it's a kind of food that's very different from junk food. Okay, I want to conclude with Psalm 1 because it's one of the famous psalms of this kind of meditation. When a lot of later Christians have thought about the ways in which Mary responds to the angel's call upon her life, where she says, be it unto me as you've said. This is as coming from, and then of course because she sings this song that is a riff on Old Testament prophecy, that Mary is someone who has meditated on the word, and that's why she's able to respond as she does. This is why in all of the paintings of the Annunciation, Mary has the Bible, right, that she's reading, she's prayerfully reading, and her finger is often stuck in it, or sometimes several places, if you notice this, right, because she's like studying the scriptures, right? So her act of obedience is predicated upon a life spent ruminating on the scriptures. But Psalm 1 is the sort of classical locus for this. And I thought we should conclude maybe with Lectio Divina, right? Because that's a way of ruminating on the scriptures. Do you guys know? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read Psalm 1 3 times. I'm going to pause for about a minute in between each time. A minute is a long time, but you guys are capable of this. There's different ways of doing Lectio Divina. I'm not going to give you different things to think about. I just want you to hear the words. I think sometimes when you hear it multiple times after a pause, they hit you differently. You hear different things. And just think about it like chewing the cud. Like what you're doing is chewing the cud. And again, if you want to cultivate capacities for attention, capacities to attend well, you can practice, right? And you can get better. There's a lot of things you can do to get better. I think even something as simple as cultivating a craft, a physical craft, whether it be baking or woodworking or gardening, something that requires you to attend to the world and be responsive to something that's maybe unyielding, like a frustrating piece of wood. That strengthens attention, right? That can teach you to attend in a more responsive way. And I think those muscles then translate, right? These are transferable qualities. So I'm going to read this and give you a minute, and then read it again, give you a minute, read it again, give you a minute, and then close. I would just encourage you to chew the cud. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. All right. Anything stand out you want to share from that psalm, those images?
Meditating on the word and delighting in the word assumes that we've slowed down enough
Yes.
to let that happen.
Yeah.
That he planted by streams of water, meditate on his word day and night. It's just being regularly fed by that. And that gives us a depth and a strength that we're not going
Yeah, you're not blowing away like the chaff. And also, it enables you to yield your fruit in season, right? So again, there's a sense that you're able to bless the community with the fruit that is born from this. So it is outward oriented, right? There's a paradox that as you contemplate the scriptures, you become the kind of person, the kind of tree that is able to be a blessing. On the right side, I have a poem by Wendell Berry. I got to include a Berry poem. I'm not going to read this, but in some ways, this is I think a poetic, artistic, violin-like response to Psalm 1. So, if you're interested, you can read that on your own. Next week, we'll look at time. Okay? How to tell time. Thanks, y'all.